David was standing at the hotel bar, drink in hand, telling everyone who would listen how I was just being dramatic, and that I needed to calm down and stop embarrassing myself. He was so confident that his charm and my supposed overreaction would smooth everything over, just like it always had before. But when I walked into that crowded lobby with the hotel manager, the security footage on a tablet, and every guest from our wedding party gathered around, his smug smile vanished completely. The color drained from his face. His drink slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor, and he actually stumbled backward like he'd been physically struck. The phone call came 3 years ago on a Tuesday morning. My divorce lawyer, Janet, with news I never expected to hear. "Sarah," she said, her voice unusually excited, "you need to sit down. David is dead, and there's something about his will you need to know." I was in my small apartment, the one I'd moved to after everything fell apart. Simple, clean, nothing fancy. Just me, my books, and the quiet life I'd built from the ashes of what I thought was going to be my happily ever after. I'd been working as a freelance graphic designer, barely making ends meet, but I was proud of the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. "Sarah, are you there?" Janet's voice pulled me back. "Yes, I'm here. What about his will? He left you everything. The house, the business, the investments. Everything." I sat there in stunned silence, holding the phone, trying to process what she'd just told me. David, the man who had humiliated me on what should have been the happiest week of our lives, had left me his entire estate. Made no sense. Let me take you back to the beginning, to how this all started. I met David when I was 26, working at a small marketing firm downtown. He was 31, successful, charming in that easy way that some men have. He owned a financial consulting company and seemed to have his life perfectly mapped out. I was drawn to his confidence, his ambition. He made me feel like I was part of something bigger, something important. Our courtship was like something out of a movie. Expensive dinners, weekend getaways, flowers delivered to my office. He proposed after 18 months, and I said yes without hesitation. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I ignored. The way he'd flirt with waitresses in front of me, then laugh it off as just being friendly. How he'd make little comments about other women's appearances, rating them like they were objects. The way he'd dismiss my concerns with a kiss and a promise. But I was young and I thought love could change him. I thought marriage would settle him down. We planned an elaborate destination wedding in the Bahamas. A week-long celebration at a luxury resort, with 40 of our closest friends and family. My parents, who had worked double shifts their entire lives to send me to college, spent their savings to help pay for it. They were so proud, so happy to see their daughter marrying this successful man. The wedding itself was beautiful. Perfect weather, perfect venue, perfect ceremony. David looked handsome in his tuxedo. I felt like a princess in my dress. When we exchanged vows, I believed every word. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. I meant it all. The first 3 days of our honeymoon were everything I dreamed of. We stayed in the honeymoon suite, spent hours on the beach, had romantic dinners. David seemed genuinely happy, attentive, loving. I remember thinking that this was it. This was the life I'd always wanted. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. I'd gone back to the room early, around 9 o'clock. I had a headache from too much sun, and David said he'd stay at the bar with some of the guys for one more drink. I took a shower, got into my pajamas, and was settling in to read when I realized I'd left my phone charger in David's college friend Tony's room from earlier that day when we'd all been hanging out. The rooms were all on the same floor, just down the hall. I threw on a robe and flip-flops and walked to Tony's room. I knocked but no answer. The door was slightly ajar, which was odd, so I pushed it open just enough to peek inside. What I saw will be burned into my memory forever. David was there, in Tony's bed with Jennifer. Jennifer, who had been my maid of honor. Jennifer, who I'd known since college. Jennifer, who had helped me pick out my wedding dress and had held my hand during the bachelorette party when I'd gotten emotional talking about how much I loved David. They didn't see me. They were too caught up in each other to notice the door opening wider. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, watching my husband of 4 days betraying everything we'd just promised each other. I quietly closed the door and walked back to our suite on shaking legs. I sat on the bed, staring at the wall, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to burst back in there, to scream, to confront them. But another part of me, the part that would prove to be wiser, told me to think first. I spent the next hour pacing the room, my mind racing. Then I remembered something. The hotel had security cameras in the hallways. If I could get footage of David going into Tony's room, I'd have proof. Not just my word against his. I called the front desk and asked to speak with the manager. I told him I was a guest, that there had been an incident, and that I needed to speak with him immediately. 20 minutes later, Michael Santos, the hotel manager, was at my door. I explained the situation calmly, professionally. I told him I needed to see the security footage from the hallway, that I suspected my husband of adultery and needed proof for legal reasons. Michael was hesitant at first, but when I explained that I was prepared to make this a much bigger problem for the hotel if I didn't get cooperation, he agreed to help. We went down to the security office, and there it was, clear as day. David entering Tony's room at 9:47 p.m. The timestamp was perfect, undeniable proof. I need a copy of this footage, I told Michael. And I need your help with something else. What I did next was calculated, deliberate, and absolutely devastating. I asked Michael to make an announcement over the hotel's PA system, calling all wedding guests to gather in the main lobby for a special surprise presentation from the bride. It was 11:30 p.m. by then, late enough that people were curious but not so late that they wouldn't come. Within 20 minutes, everyone was there. My parents, David's parents, all our friends, Tony, and yes, Jennifer, who had somehow managed to make it down to the lobby looking perfectly put together, as if she hadn't just been in bed with my husband. David arrived last, clearly having been dragged down by someone who'd told him about the announcement. He looked confused but not worried. Why would he be? He had no idea what was coming. I stood in the center of that lobby, surrounded by everyone we loved, everyone who had come to celebrate our marriage, and I began to speak. Thank you all for coming down here tonight. I know it's late, and I know this is unusual, but I have something very important to share with all of you. I looked directly at David, who was standing near the bar, drink already in hand. He gave me that charming smile, the one that had won me over all those years ago. 4 days ago, we all gathered here to celebrate love, commitment, and the promise of faithfulness. We heard beautiful vows about honor and cherish and forsaking all others. I could see some people starting to look confused, sensing that this wasn't going to be the kind of surprise they'd expected. Tonight, I discovered just how much those vows meant to my husband. David's smile faltered slightly, but he still didn't understand what was happening. At 9:47 p.m. this evening, security cameras captured my husband entering room 347, which belongs to his friend Tony. He's still there now, with my maid of honor, Jennifer. The lobby went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that marble floor. David's face went through a series of changes. Confusion, then understanding, then panic. Sarah, what are you doing? This is crazy. You're being dramatic. I interrupted. Am I being dramatic, David? Michael, would you please show everyone what we discussed? The hotel manager stepped forward with a tablet, and on the screen was the security footage, crystal clear, showing David entering Tony's room. He played it for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate and explosive. My mother gasped and covered her mouth. David's father looked like he might have a heart attack. Tony, who had been standing in the back, tried to slip away, but everyone turned to look at him. And Jennifer started to cry and ran toward the elevator. But David tried to save face. That's when he said what I quoted at the beginning. He actually tried to convince everyone that I was overreacting, that I was being dramatic, that this was all some kind of misunderstanding. This is insane, he said, his voice getting louder. Sarah, you're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing all of us. Whatever you think you saw. I didn't think I saw anything, David. I know what I saw, and now everyone else knows too. That's when he stumbled backward, when the drink slipped from his hand, when the full reality of his situation hit him. His marriage was over, his reputation was destroyed, and he'd done it to himself in front of everyone who mattered to him. I looked around that lobby, at all those faces staring back at me. Some were horrified, some were sympathetic, some were angry. But none of them were looking at David with the respect and admiration they'd had just minutes before. "I'm sorry you all had to see this," I said quietly. "I'm sorry your vacation has been ruined by this revelation." But I couldn't pretend not to know. I couldn't smile and play the happy bride for the rest of the week knowing what I know. I turned to my parents, who looked heartbroken, and said, "Mom, Dad, I'm going to pack my things and fly home tomorrow. I'm sorry." Then I walked to the elevator and went back to what had been our honeymoon suite for the last time. The divorce was ugly. David fought me on everything, trying to claim that I'd humiliated him, that I'd damaged his business reputation, that I was entitled to nothing because I'd caused a scene. His lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable. But I had that security footage. I had witnesses. I had Michael Santos from the hotel, who testified about what he'd seen and heard. The divorce took 8 months, and when it was over, I walked away with barely anything. A small settlement, enough to get by. But David kept the house, the business, most of the investments. His family blamed me for the whole thing. They said I should have handled it privately, that I'd destroyed relationships and hurt innocent people. Jennifer lost her job and had to move to another city. Tony's marriage ended 6 months later when his wife found out he'd been covering for David. But David landed on his feet like he always did. His business actually grew after the divorce. He played the victim, told people I'd been controlling and jealous, that he'd made one mistake and I'd blown up his entire life over it. Some people believed him. He remarried 2 years later, to a 23-year-old named Brittany who worked as a receptionist at his company. They had a big wedding, even bigger than ours had been. I heard about it through mutual friends who felt obligated to tell me, though I never asked. I rebuilt my life slowly, carefully. I moved to a different city, started my freelance business, made new friends who didn't know my history. I dated occasionally, but nothing serious. I'd learned to be suspicious of charm, to look for character instead of charisma. Which brings me back to that phone call from Janet 3 years ago. After she told me about the will, I had to ask the obvious question. Why? Why would he leave me everything? He remarried, didn't he have a wife? He did, Janet said. But apparently, Brittany had been cheating on him for the last year of their marriage. With his business partner. David found out 2 weeks before he died. The irony was almost too much to process. "There's more, Sarah. He left you a letter. You need to come to my office to read it." I drove to Janet's office that afternoon, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. What could David possibly have to say to me after all these years? The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in David's familiar scrawl. I'll never forget the opening lines. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm dead, and you probably think this is all some kind of cruel joke. It's not. I'm leaving you everything because you were the only person who ever truly loved me, and I threw it away for nothing." He went on to explain how his life had unraveled after our divorce, how the guilt had eaten away at him, how he'd never been able to maintain a real relationship because he'd destroyed the only real one he'd ever had. He wrote about how Brittany's betrayal had felt like cosmic justice, how he'd finally understood what he'd put me through. But the part that broke me, that made me cry for the first time in years, was near the end. "You were right to expose me that night in the lobby. I spent years telling people you'd overreacted, that you'd been cruel and vindictive. But you weren't. You were honest, and you were brave, and you deserved so much better than what I gave you. I hope someday you can forgive me, not for my sake but for yours. You deserved to be cherished, Sarah. You deserved everything I promised you and never delivered." The letter was dated 2 days before he died of a heart attack at age 37. 2 days before his young, cheating wife thought she was going to inherit everything. I can only imagine Brittany's face when the lawyer read that will. David had left her nothing, absolutely nothing. The house, the business that was now worth over $2 million, the investments, the life insurance, all of it came to me. I sold the business and the house immediately. I donated a substantial amount to charity, paid off my parents' mortgage, and used the rest to start a foundation for women leaving abusive relationships. I kept only what I needed to live comfortably, to finally have the security I'd been working so hard to build on my own. The foundation has helped over 300 women in the past 2 years. We provide legal aid, temporary housing, job placement services, counseling. Every woman we help is a small act of redemption, a way to turn David's betrayal into something meaningful. I think about that night in the Bahamas lobby sometimes. About the choice I made to expose the truth rather than suffer in silence. At the time, people called me vindictive, said I'd gone too far. But I know now that I was right. The truth matters, even when it's painful, even when it destroys the illusion of happiness. David learned that lesson too, eventually. It just took him 8 years and losing everything to understand what he'd thrown away. I never remarried. I'm 42 now, and I've built a life I'm proud of. I have work that matters, friends who value honesty over charm, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. Sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that's more poetic than anything we could imagine. David betrayed me on our honeymoon, destroyed our marriage for a meaningless affair, and spent years painting me as the villain in our story. But in the end, he knew the truth. And he made sure I got the vindication I never asked for, but probably always deserved. The man who threw away real love for meaningless pleasure learned too late what he'd lost. And the woman he'd betrayed and humiliated got the last word after all. If you enjoyed this story of truth and justice, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories of vindication. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting the truth speak for itself.